by introducing myself. If we haven't met, I'm Tim Fawcett. I run the cybersecurity practice here at Guernsey. If you're not familiar with Guernsey, Guernsey is I think we're about a 95-year-old engineering firm. So we do a lot of work in the engineering and A&E space, environmental space, and quite a bit of work in utilities privatization. Growing out of that and those needs, we started the cybersecurity practice. And from there, it was a natural progression to go into CMMC. And so we've really set ourselves up as being one of the foremost leaders in this industry, especially as it comes to supporting, especially companies that are in our A&E space. So with that being said, I want to go and get started. And as an agenda today, here's what we're going to talk about. And then again, I always apologize for these webinars. It's not always the most ideal situation, but I think we're all used to it by now. But if there are any questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll be able to answer them that way. And you could probably even uncheck your mute and just ask a question if you have one as we go. But all things being equal, we'll probably have time to answer them in the end. That's the plan. So what we want to talk about is why are we even doing CMMC? And so that's a pretty brief conversation. I think that nothing's really changed in that from 1.0 to 2.0. We'll talk about what federal contract information is and controlled unclassified information, the reason we're here, what it is that we're being asked to protect with these regulations. We're going to be talking about the major changes from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0. So we're talking about scoping, which is one of the major changes from 1.0 to 2.0. So we're going to be talking about rulemaking and timelines. So now that 2.0 is here, what does that mean for when you're actually going to have these new requirements in place based on what we know now? We're talking about the CMMC ecosystem. So when you do have to become compliant, who are the players in the industry and how do you navigate that? What changes can you expect compared to what you're doing now as opposed to what you need to be doing by the time you become compliant? And so we'll go through that in a pretty sufficient amount of detail. And then we're going to talk about some industry specific terms, since most of the folks in this call are related to the engineering type services. There's a few challenges that are industry specific that we're going to talk about. And then we'll have probably about 15 minutes for questions, assuming I talk fast enough. So let's make sure. Okay, so why is there a CMMC? So first thing we want to talk about is the defense industrial base. So what we're talking about is anybody that works in supporting the DoD at this point. And so that's going to go beyond just the people who have primary contracts. It's also going to be the subcontractors of those and anybody that supports those individuals. And so there's, by some estimates, up to 200,000 companies and subcontractors involved in this space. And it's everything from weapons systems to people who build buildings, people who run utility systems. There's everything from foreign to domestic entities. We have bases all over the world, and so this can apply to a lot of folks. There's a better way of doing this. So some of the examples of what we're talking about is everything from food suppliers, janitorial services are going to have some level of CMMC. So even if you were just cleaning the bathrooms on a military base and you're collecting information about you have a contract to do that, that's going to be covered under your CMMC level 1, which we'll talk a little bit about. And that's a fairly easy bar to cover. But the point is, all these people are included on it. But we're also talking about people who are involved in construction, excavation, computer and office equipment, telecommunications, utilities. Some of the risks that we're talking about with some of these is, so we have, business email compromise. If I'm have relationships with the companies and my partners get compromised, I have a better chance of then getting into compromising my company. Then there's island hopping. I can get from one company who has a relationship with another one. I can get on there. One of the biggest concerns to the DoD is going to be supply chain disruptions and corruption. So anytime you break something down line or disrupt the ability to provide services or products to creating whatever services you're being asked to provide under your contract, it makes things difficult. Some of the other information, things like troop movements, if you are able to see how much food the chow hall is ordering, you might be able to pick up the fact that there's might be some troop buildup, and so the idea of it is this information is while it's unclassified, it is controlled, and in combination with each other, it can cause it can allow the enemy to find out information that wouldn't normally be privy to. So this slide over here is the main reason that, and I put this in all my presentations because it's really kind of the best example of really what the problem is. Keeping in mind that we have had cybersecurity requirements in our contracts for several years. In fact, they're the same requirements that are required under the CMMC 2.0. But in that time frame, this is the time that we've built the F-35 fighter, and the Chinese built their J-31, which looks somewhat familiar. And some other examples, our Humvee that's tried and true. This is the Chinese version of it. So even with all the controls we have in place, improvements need to be made both on the DoD side, and I think the DoD is admitting that they have a problem with communication and communicating what's controlled and what's not controlled, and I think they're working on that. But the main goal of it is that our ability to keep our information to ourselves and not providing it to the enemy is something that's clearly something we need to work on. So we can't really talk about CMMC without talking about federal contract information and controlled unclassified information, which we call CUI or CUI, depending on where you come from. But I'll call it all those things. But the first thing we're really talking about is federal contract information. What you need to know about that is basically if you have federal contract information, you're going to have a requirement to meet the CMMC level 1 when the time comes. It's actually a requirement now. It's really our 17 safeguarding requirements. But really what we're talking about here is going to be non-public information about provided to a subcontractor. So whether or not it's considered CUI or not, even the knowledge that you have a contract or that you are providing information to a subcontractor that you are doing certain things, that's all filed under federal contract information. So information while you're developing a contract or grant or other legal agreements, reports, briefings, and deliverables all associated with the contracting vehicles, and then anything related to transactions. So and again, this is a pretty broad topic. So the main reason for talking about this is because regardless of who you are, if you are involved in a contract, you probably have federal contact information at some point in time. And so at the very minimum, you're going to have to be this CMMC level 1, which is going to be a self-assessment, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. Okay. The other thing is going to be the controlled unclassified information. Now, we give an entire presentation on controlled unclassified information, and that usually takes at least an hour, and there's lots of questions about it. And I think if we can just all acknowledge that the DoD isn't exactly doing their process for communicating what is considered controlled is not as robust as it needs to be for their for this to really work, and I think they're improving upon that. But the idea of it is that they're going to come to you in your contracts and they're going to tell you, hey, what we're providing you is going to be considered controlled, and you need to protect it under these mechanisms. And there's usually going to be digital data, physical documents, representations, images, building specifications, any information. And also within your contracts, they are supposed to be able to communicate in those contracts what it is that you're creating for them that's going to be considered CUI as well. It's fairly easy if the DoD gives you something that says here, this is CUI, protect it. But if the answer is you're actually creating intellectual property that is CUI, then you need to be aware of that as well. The main source for what's controlled unclassified information is through the Records Administration, the Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, and they're the definitive answer for what's classified and not classified. But the actual list of what's classified and not classified is actually CUI, so it's really hard to get your hands on that. I say that because I find it somewhat ironic, but I honestly think that this is a problem that a lot of people are having a hard time getting past, especially in certain types of contracts. I think it's going to improve. I know that the DoD is working on their measures, which usually falls from, hey, everything I'm going to give you is CUI on one side, which isn't the right way to go, to certain things are not CUI. So, okay. So a lot of you were aware of what was going on with CMMC 1.0, and then it ended about last November where they said, no timeout. We're changing the game a little bit, and that's really what I want to talk about in these next several slides. There were some fairly significant changes, but what actually happens is it kind of put things on hold. So I really want to make sure that everybody understands where we're going and what the new standards are going to look like. Here's some of the major changes in here. There's going to be changes to the levels of attestation requirements. So in 1.0, there was going to be a requirement that everybody, almost regardless of whether you were the company that cleaned the toilets on the Army base, or if you were a major weapons manufacturer, you had some level of attestation or third-party assessment that was going to occur. One major change is those smaller ones, those level ones, they're all going to be self-attestation. And then there's going to be some that are going to be at the level 2 that might be self-attestation as well. Another major change is that they're now aligning 100% with the NIST standards. So those same 171 scores that you've been doing self-assessments on and reporting to SPURS are the exact same requirements that are going to be required under CMMC 2.0, with some caveats, including a more robust scoping process. And well, there's some slides where we can talk a little bit more about that. So they're going to allow some cases for plans of actions and milestones, whereas before there was none required at all, or was none allowed at all. And then we're going to be able to, in more instances, be able to demonstrate compliance through self-assessments, and how you're doing that is going to change a little bit. There's going to be some additional processes for adding waivers for certain CMMC requirements under certain limited circumstances. All the details haven't come out on that one yet, but we'll talk about that. And then there's just going to be updated scoping guidance, and we'll talk quite a bit about that coming up. Okay, so here's the new levels. So there was 5 levels before, you may have remembered. Now there's only 3, which actually makes sense. Anybody who's in this space, I think they can all agree, at least I do, that CMMC 1.0 was, I think we kind of overshot the target a little bit. This new level really kind of puts things down into something that's more consumable by our DIB companies. But level 1 is going to be foundational. As I said, this is going to be most of these DIB companies, and there's about 140,000 of these companies, and these are the ones that are going to have the federal contract information, and they basically are under your basic federal acquisition requirements. There's 17 requirements, but under CMMC 1.0 or 2.0, you'll have to report your compliance with that on an annual basis. Okay, level 2 is advanced. So this is going to be the bulk of our DIB companies, and there's an estimate from anywhere from 80 to 40,000 organizations that are going to handle CUI. And so these are the organizations that actually have CUI. And again, there's companies out there that know they have it, and there's some over there that think they have it. Regardless, within your contracting vehicles, it'll have a requirement on there. Usually now it'll look like it's the same one that requires you to submit your score to SPRS or SPURS. When CMMC 2.0 comes on, it's going to require you to either have a self-attestation. Well, it's actually going to require you to do a self-attestation every year, but then it might also require you to have a third party come in and assess you. The third level is expert, and I think there's probably going to be about 500 companies. And again, these are all subject to change because we're still in rulemaking. But these are the companies that handle a lot of and very sensitive CUI. Now, how this is expected to work is that you will get an assessment at level 2 by your third-party attestation company, and then the DoD will come in through DCMA or DIBCAC and actually come and do your level 3 assessment. The difference being that one of them is going to be the NIST 800-171 requirements, or A requirements that you're reporting now, and then there's a second level, I guess that's A, that's going to be required under level 3. So most companies I talk to are going to be in level 2. I think there's a conversation about level 1, but as far as the assistance needed for that, it's not really that much. Level 3, I think that a lot of companies are going to be prepared to do that, but it's going to be several years before that's actually going to be a requirement, especially with the requirement that the DoD is actually doing your assessment. So right now I'm advising most people to go ahead and plan for level 2, and then at least have a mechanism for understanding what's required under level 3 and when that might be a requirement. So this is what it looked like before. We'll kind of go through this a little quicker. You'll see there was these previous 17 requirements under level 1. Those are the exact same thing now. Now there's an annual self-assessment that's going to be required. There was a level 2, which if any of you recall anything about CMMC 1.0, didn't actually exist. It was just a mediary because there was such a big difference between 17 and 130. They put a secondary goal, but there was no requirements for anybody to be certified at that level. And then they hadn't even put out the information on levels 5 and 4. So really, most of the people were gunning for level 3. You'll see basically there's 130 practices, which included all the 800-171 requirements, plus 20 more requirements. They took out those additional 20 requirements, put some of them kind of back in through our scoping guidance, but then relied solely on NIST, who is the real body that should be coming up with these requirements, which is a good thing because that takes the DoD out of the policy-making business, which is all good things, I think. So, as I said, we're going to be aligning the CMMC with existing cybersecurity standards, and that's going to be basically those standards created by NIST. Previously, the levels 2, 3, 4, and 5 are now gone, and now there's going to be the level 2 and the level 3. So level 2 is going to be the NIST 800-171, and then there's this NIST 800-172, which is some additional requirements. They're going to be required up for level 3. Our main target for most of the people I talk to is this level 2. So one of the things that the major changes is they're going to allow for plans of actions and milestones, which was not allowed before. So basically, once you had to hire your third-party assessing company, come in and do your assessment, there was no ability for you to say, hey, I haven't done this particular thing yet, but I have a plan to do it. Under 2.0, the way it's shaping up based on the rulemaking that we know about now, it looks like it's going to require that certain CMMC requirements are going to be able to become compliant and receive awards if certain items have POAMs associated with them. And those are generally some of the lower risk items. And again, the full guidance isn't out on this yet, but it's looking like it's probably going to align with the things that are scored 1 in the SPURS self-assessment now. But the idea of it is you'll be able to get that POAM, and then the other caveat is that any C3PAO, not just the company that assessed you, can come in there and clear those POAMs. Now, I want to keep in mind that this isn't like a POAM that you can, like they're often used now, where if I have, you're supposed to have compliant with all these 110 items, but 30 of them I have a plan to correct them. The requirements are going to be for a very limited time. We're talking 30 to maybe 60 days. You're going to have to be able to comply with these POAMs. So this isn't the same thing where you can have unlimited time frame for keeping your POAMs open. So I'm always telling companies that if you're not prepared to pass an assessment because you have POAMs in place, I'm really recommending that you correct those POAMs before you engage somebody to come in and do the assessment. And we'll talk about that a little bit more about the timing of when the CMMC requirements are going to be in place. Now, the big opportunity is there's going to be a lot more requirements for self-assessments. So self-assessments are going to be required annually, where if you're going to have a third-party assessment, they're going to be required every 3 years. That actually hasn't changed. But at this point in time, everybody is going to have to assess every year. And as opposed to assessing the way you do now, where you report your scores to SPURS, you will have to attest, somebody that's a C-level in your company will have to attest that you're actually doing all these things. So there's a little bit higher bar for compliance. They're going to, the plan is, well, and the other thing they're talking about, and I put it up here, related to the critical CUI. Some contractors are going to have a third-party assessment. Some people are going to have to just be able to do the annual assessment. And they've described it as people who have critical CUI. The problem is that the term critical hasn't really been defined. So I'm advising anybody who has CUI or the 171 requirements now, go ahead and plan on being able to pass a third-party assessment, because that's the level you want to be at to even do the self-assessment. So, so it's the same thing I just said. You might have to engage a third-party assessing organization. And then level 3 contractors will be assessed by the DCMA or DIPCAC. This is the same organization right now that's actually giving assessments to the C3 PAOs. And given that we're one of those assessed authorized C3 PAOs, we've actually passed this assessment. So we actually have some insight into how this is going to work. And this is going to be required triannually. So, okay. There's going to be some waivers for requirements under certain limited circumstances. So there's the ability to put waivers in that I don't have to comply with certain standards. Now, unlike the original version of CMMC, this, where there was no ability to say, hey, if for whatever reason this does not this doesn't fit our business model or whatever, there was really no ability to get that done. And then in mission critical instances, they're going to be able to do this thing with approval. But I'm, based on what we're seeing now and just my experience with how these things work, I'm basically suggesting that for the most part, not to count on this this waiver process. The process, well, first of all, there's no process for a C3PO to report partial compliance. So if you have a waiver in your contract and you don't have to do, requirement, 58. That's not actually how the numbers work. Let's say you don't have to do that, and that's in your contract. There's no facility right now for me as a C3PO to come in and assess you for everything except for requirement 58. Not that it can't be done or they won't solve that problem in the future, but it's going to be one of those very specific line item contract changes, and so it's going to be some challenges. So one of the other major changes with CMMC 2.0 is going to be the scoping. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. If you have to go through this process, and you all will have to go through this process, we'll go into more detail on this, but basically, I want you to talk about a few concepts and then how we're going to go through this thing. So the first thing you're going to want to consider is whether to enclave or not to enclave. There's some guidance out there on what that looks like, and basically, if you have just a subsystem, so if you're going to decide, hey, I'm only going to keep CUI in these systems and not in these other systems, there's some pretty strict requirements for how they need to be layered. If they're going to be protected at the network layer, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details from the technical standpoint, but basically you're going to have to protect it on the network level. So you're going to have firewalls and routers and things between the two, or you're going to have things fully in the cloud. There's very specific things you want to put in your system security plan on how you're making that happen. And then what will happen is, regardless of whether you're really enclaving or not enclaving, they're really wanting you to be able to list every single asset you have. That's going to include everything from physical devices to software, to cameras, to anything that might be on your network or might be off your network and might have the possibility of containing CUI. So we're talking about cloud applications and things like that. So we're going to get a list of all those things, and you're going to split them up into these categories. So there's going to be security assets, physical. Oh, actually, that's not the right slide for this thing. But these are all the. Sorry, these are the controls that we're talking about for your enclaves. The slide that we're going to want to talk about here is splitting these things up into these categories. So here we go. Here's the categories you're going to want to split up all your assets into. So there's going to be controlled unclassified information. These are the assets that are actually going to process, store, and transmit CUI. So think about if you have a file share. We know for a fact that there's going to be CUI on there. And maybe you have a cloud service where you're going to exchange that. We know for a fact this is going to be an in-scope product. And then there's going to be security protection assets. Those are the assets that are used to protect those assets. So if you have any servers or software that does authentication, so we're talking about your domain controllers, so your Azure AD, your SIMs, any of those things that actually do security are going to be included in this level of asset. And under these things, all those assets are going to be assessed against the CMMC practices. This makes it kind of an interesting, I want to say scope creep, but it does change the scope on what you're going to have to assess for CMMC. So if I'm really limiting everything down to just my enclave, that where my CMMC assets are going to, where my CUI assets are going to be, then I can really limit that scope. But when you start bringing in these security protection assets, where these are the same assets that are going to where I authenticate to get my IDs and passwords, or if I start sending my logs to these things, it winds up expanding our scope a little bit. So we want to have a really good understanding of where these assets live, how you're protecting them, and once we go through the scoping exercise, we'll find those things. The second part of this thing is going to be your contractor risk managed assets. So the best way to describe these are going to be any asset that is not intended to contain or transmit CUI, but could. So think of your email system. If you have it set up so we don't pass CUI through our email system, but we think there's a really high possibility that it could, or even just a possibility that somebody could send me CUI through my email, then I want to include this in my system security plan, do limited spot checking, and make sure that we're identifying those assets, so we conduct the assessor, and you can do limited spot checking to ensure that these things don't just kind of drift into your overall risk managed assets or into your CUI assets. So then we're going to have specialized assets. These have the same requirement for being documented essentially within your system security plans. These are going to include things like SCADA systems, so any Internet of Things. So if you have your smart cameras, your smart TVs and things like that, those all fall underneath this. The main takeaway is that it doesn't matter what it is. If you're interacting with it or your employees are interacting with it, we want to acknowledge it in our system security plan, and explain why these are not at risk of being assets that are going to have CUI. Now, keeping in mind, it mentions operational technology, but depending on what business you're in, so for instance, if you're in utilities privatization, the way that utility data has been described as CUI. So in those particular instances, depending on the industry you're in, those assets might actually fall under CUI assets just by the nature of the data they have and the nature of your contract and what you're doing. So I want to point that out because I'm saying over here that OT would be a specialized asset, but that depends on your use case, which is part of this scoping exercise. And then you'll have out of scope assets, and these are basically they're required to be physically or logically separated from CUI assets. We talked about that enclave process for at least a slide longer than I thought I was earlier. And the idea of that one is that these are these assets that are out there that there's really no likelihood at all, no possibility whatsoever that they're gonna have CUI. Printers don't fall under this. We maybe, I don't want to say deluded ourselves, but we at least believed at one point in time we could make printers out of scope assets for any number of reasons. But as the guidance is coming out, there's a pretty significant interest in printers. And if printers are going to be out of scope, we need to make sure that they're very specifically segmented from CUI assets, which can be done. We just want to be very particular about how we're doing that. So, and then what will happen is you'll create this document that's basically a diagram that's going to include all of your assets, not necessarily listed out by device, but generally what they are. So you can see if I'm an assessor, I can be able to pick up this document, which is going to be far more detailed than this. And we're going to be able to document, you know, what assets are out here that are out of scope and why. There's firewalls. I put my pointer on. So there's firewalls on here, and rule segmenting these things. So we have CUI assets. So where are those? Those are the actual ones that are on here. Contractor risk managed assets. These are the assets that might contain CUI, might not. And then we'll have other ones down here that are, we mentioned out of scope and specialized assets. So we have, you know, other things over here, but there's going to be a lot more detail in yours. And the other thing that it will include is almost a flow of CUI. So where does CUI live? How do you get to it? You know, if I need to log on to onto your network to access it through VPN, all that information will be contacted on here. So I either need to come through the VPN to contact it, or maybe I need to walk through a door that has a card reader to get into it. And so those are all the things that when that assessor comes to picks up your document, they're going to make sure they have a really clear idea that you understand what's in scope, and so they understand what's in scope, and so we can assess everything accordingly. And that's the big takeaway on the scoping guidance. And I talked about it for quite a bit because it is really the major change from 1.0 to 2.0. And allows us to actually fill in a lot of the holes that were actually, in my opinion, that were in the 1.0 guidance as well. So we're actually pretty good fans of this because it does make everybody, you know, intentionally decide what's going to be in scope and what's not in scope. So, okay, so let's talk about rulemaking and timelines. You know, as I mentioned before, when they announced 2.0, they essentially put CMMC on hold. There was a interim guidance for 1.0, and so people were ready to go. We had the you know, everybody was ready to start doing assessments, and then they said, you know, timeout. We've gotten a lot of feedback here. We think we overshot it. There were some major concerns that especially small businesses had. How can we correct those? And so they essentially put CMMC on hold and put these changes into effect. So for any of you who understand government, you know, sausage making, which I really don't, I just know that the process takes anywhere from 9 to 24 months. And so we know that there's not going to be any requirement for doing the CMMC things until that requirement is in place. We have some people saying, hey, we're just holding off right now until, because, you know, we did a lot of planning for 1.0, and then they put the brakes on that one. Let's really find out where this thing washed out. I'm recommending that that's a maybe not to go that way. And the reason I say that is for a couple of reasons. First is that the requirements are really now that you have to do NIST 800-171 and report your score to SPRS, and you have to do that now. And once CMMC is a requirement, whether it's in 2 years, whether it's in 9 months, that's not going to change. What's going to change is the little bit lack of ability to be able to use POAMs and plan to go forward, and maybe the requirement to have a third party assess it, and that requirement for your executive management to sign off that you're doing these things. So really what we're basically talking about here is the difference between what's required now and what's going to be required and when this thing is live, is your ability to prove to somebody else, whether it be your executive management or a third-party assessor, that you're doing these things and you're doing them 100%. That's depending on who you're asking. That bar is at different heights. It's been my experience that that getting to a level that you can prove things tends to be a different level of documentation and effort that we need to put in place. So. But the main thing is we think that it's going to be included in all DIB contracts by 2026. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but that's a pretty good bet that they're going to roll this thing out like they were before. Certain contracts are going to get it first, and then they're going to roll them out. Contractors that have these 50-year contracts, for like utilities privatization, you'll have the opportunity to add these, and they'll start adding these things through contract mods over the next several years. So. So after the public comment period, it will go into effect, and there's really no reason to think it won't. One of the reasons we're pretty sure that the DoD is definitely on board for going forward is that they're going to start allowing voluntary assessments, and what that means is that CMMC is not going to be required by the DoD or by your contract until rulemaking is done. But if you're a DIB company and you're ready to go, and for whatever reason you want to you want to do this thing early, they've set up facilities that very soon we think that are going to be able to allow those things. The conditions that'll have to go through that is that the DoD says is that it's allowed. And they've already are working on the legal aspects of having that done. You had to use a C3PO that has a successful DIBCAC assessment performed. Now, Guernsey's done that. We were number 8. I think there's 12 companies now. So by the time this thing goes live as a requirement, there should be a much larger body of organizations that are going to be able to come in here and do this assessment for you. But there's a handful of them now that can do it. They had to have trained and certified assessors. One of the ways we've got around that, the problem is the assessor training isn't ready yet either. So they don't even think they're going to have testing for the first level until October. So so they facilitated that by, if you're a certified assessor, one of the C3PAOs, then you'll be able to use individuals who have taken the first level of training and use them as assessors. Plus, there's about 100 and 150 provisional assessors that can actually do this work too. And I'm one of those. So, from a Guernsey standpoint, I think we have, and some contractors, we have everybody set up to be able to do that. So the next one is that in the interim period, they're actually going to have DIBCAC participate at some level in the assessments. So, and that's really being done because after the go live, when you have a third party assess you, that third party is going to be the one saying you're assessed. In the voluntary period, the DIBCAC is going to essentially be the one saying yes, you're good to go, which is an important thing because you want to make sure that if you had to do this thing during the voluntary period, which I'm actually not recommending for most people, that when it does go live, that it grandfathers in, that the DIBCAC has said yes, that is an official assessment. And then all those things being said, the best estimates, and I'm certainly not saying this is true, but based on all the information that we're hearing, there's a distinct possibility that voluntary assessments will be able to start in July. I mainly say this not because anybody on this call or listening to this is probably a good candidate to be in the voluntary space. I'm mentioning this mainly to say that the DoD is in on this. And so there's more signs now that this is going to be the law of the land than if than even level 1, which did not actually start the provisional program yet. So let's talk about the CMMC ecosystem. It hasn't changed that much, but I want to make sure everybody kind of understands how this is going to look. So we're talking about when you're talking to people in the space, the terms that we use fall into this. Now, keeping in mind that the terms often change, and maybe even the term CMMC might even change, but these terms to describe the people involved in the ecosystem are pretty accurate. So we're talking about reliant organizations. These are going to be the people who are relying on someone to get the assessment. So that might be the DoD. The DoD wants to make sure that you're assessed. It might be a prime contractor who wants to make sure that your subcontractors are following the rules. And so the prime might be the reliant organization. And then there's the organization seeking certification. So if you're ever going to be, say, talking about an OSC, just think about that as a DIB company who needs to get a certification. So if you had to get assessed by a third party, or even likely if you're doing the self-assessment, that's really the way that you're described. And then there's individuals performing services. And this is kind of important to understand where people fall into here. So there's going to be registered practitioners, certified professionals, which the certified professional might actually be changing as part of this new ecosystem. And then there's going to be certified assessors, and there's actually different levels of those assessors. The main thing with it is some people are going to be qualified to assist companies or OSCs with preparing, and then you have to be a certified assessor to actually be able to be that third party who actually does the assessment. There is no requirement that you can have an assess. There are some assessment companies that only do assessments. There's some assessing companies that do both. Guernsey is one of those companies that do both. So we are helping people get ready and pass the assessments, which then prevents us from doing any kind of consulting with them. And then there's the side where we can just do assessments for folks, and our plans to do both. And then there's the different organizations. So you'll hear that there's registered provider organizations, and these are companies, lots of MSPs and different consulting firms out there that have done certain things and had certain background checks performed to understand that they are really in a good position to help you prepare for these assessments coming up. And then you have the third party assessment organization, or C3PAO. These are the companies that are authorized through many different requirements, including passing their own CMMC assessment. They can actually do that assessment for you. Again, those C3PAOs can also do your assessing, your consulting and assistance, but if they do, they can't then be your third-party assessor. So that's kind of where this thing looks, and this is where how the whole process will work. So I have an OSC, and I need to get assessed. I'm going to hire a C3PAO, or I don't have to. I can just do this on my own, or an RPO to do this optional consulting. And so those are going to include all these registered practitioners and professionals and assessors. And they're really the ones that are going to be able to help you put the processes in place, maybe execute some of those things, but fill those roles and really answer those questions about how are you going to implement these programs, and then pass your assessment. And then once you're ready to go, you're going to hire a C3PAO, but not this C3PAO. And they're going to hire certified assessors. So there's very specific training that these people are going to have to take, and they will actually do your assessment. And this is actually, I think this might have actually been a change, but I haven't updated my slide because it's not fully there yet. The idea of it is that they would report the results back to the CMMC, and then the CMMC would do the certification. But I think how that's actually going to change is that this line is going to go here. It's actually going to be the C3PAO providing the assessment, and that there's some technical and legal reasons for that, mainly related to ISO, but the slide's still relevant. Just keeping in mind that this C3PO is on here. One of the other things that's on here is that if you wind up getting a POAM, any C3PO, not necessarily this one, will be able to clear that POAM if that's something that you need to do. Okay. If you need to hire a C3PO, you go out to the marketplace, and they've been promising there's going to be a new website soon. But if you go out to the CMMC.AB/org/marketplace, you'll be able to go to the authorized C3PAOs, and these are the companies that have actually passed their assessment. You'll see Guernsey's right here. Oh, Guernsey was right there. But you'll see we're in pretty good company. Never mind, I can't this thing to work. We're in pretty good company. Bose Allen, which everybody's heard of, got added this week, and there's a couple other decent sized organizations. Some of them very focused on just doing assessments. Other ones are doing both of it. So, but if you need to find that CMMC or somebody to help you on it, this is the best place to go, is this marketplace over here. Or you can just call me and I'll hook you up. So, so what changes can you expect? And this is kind of the thing I want to talk about. Obviously, you have to do 171 now. And we've been helping several companies get ready, and there's a handful of things that have shown up that that seem to be the big challenges or the big things that are different than what they're doing now, or what they're being required to do now, that they're going to have to do under CMMC. The first thing is going to be policies and procedures. While they're not specifically required under the guidance, you're going to have a very difficult time passing an assessment by a third party without policies and procedures. So while 1.0 had very specific requirements that were required for those, and there's less of those, there's still the requirement that you have to have these policies and procedures. So a lot of work in writing those things. You'll find that IT people don't like to write policies and procedures, but there are people that can help you do those, like Guernsey. Acceptable use and other policies. They need to be verified every year. So when you are actually writing these policies, you need to go through every year. You need to make sure everybody's notified of them every year. Multi-factor authentication is a big change. So basically, for those two types of assets that we're talking about are the security assets and the CUI assets. So really, you're going to have multi-factor authentication for anybody that has network access to non-privileged accounts, as well as all privileged accounts. So really what the takeaway in that one is pretty much all access to assets that are considered CUI assets are going to require a multi-factor authentication, because the only way that it's not is if it's a local access, and most people don't keep things on a local computer. So we've found across the board that usually the multi-factor schemes that people have in place are not going to be adequate for this, and so that's all of the work we're helping folks with now. Accounts that are assigned to non-employees, there's requirements about when how that gets done. There's actually depending on how you go about doing this for subcontractors, this actually changes a little bit too. So there's some changes there. There's split tunneling isn't going to be allowed, but this is for your VPN access, and so that winds up being a trouble for a lot of companies who actually are required to do split tunneling. And this isn't the forum for me to go into a lot of detail on this, but there is some requirements that we want to make sure that we're setting up for that. And then there's audit logging. It technically requires a central repository. It doesn't actually, but there's the strict letter of the law, and then there's requirements that are actually probably required if you are going to do this in a realistic way. And so usually when it comes to logging and monitoring, there's going to be some additional requirements that are going to be involved, at least to get past the assessments. So vulnerability management, it probably is not done as well as it needs to be, and it also needs to be tested periodically. The configuration management, whereas before we may have said, hey, we just use the default settings that comes with the computer. I guess theoretically you can do that, but you have to be able to monitor those default settings. So that the answer we use default settings probably isn't going to cut it. And so that's one of the things we were working on with folks a lot. Vendor management. So you go through and you're sharing CUI with your subcontractors, or even to do bids, there's going to be some requirements. And so we're working with folks on that one. There's certain requirements for software whitelisting and blacklisting that doesn't seem to be done really well by a lot of folks. And then there's going to be a little bit more requirements for physical security. This isn't a full list, but these are the things that we've been showing up that are going to be higher risk items. We talked about maybe having to put things into enclaves. We had to do risk assessments, data classificational change, and then incident response. So I put a few industry specific concerns in here, and I don't think I have too many of these things, but for A&E firms especially, drawings are almost always going to be considered FCI, and we have some concerns sometimes when you're trying to submit some of these drawings and things for people to bid. And so that's one of the challenges we're working through. Drawings and other technical documents as 3D renderings are large files, and they might be considered CUI. And so when you're talking about very large files, sometimes there's some challenges on how you can keep those. Cloud services don't work really well for those. So we need to talk about that. Non-DoD projects are the same as DoD projects. So if you are sharing systems and you have, you're building a building for, a basketball team who's not a DoD contractor, but you're using the same systems as the DoD projects, they're all going to be in scope because of their proximity to each other. So if you need to separate those out, it winds up being a risk approach that we had to go through and talk about. Prime contractors had to push down the requirements. If you're a subcontractor, you're already aware of that. Sometimes the primes are requiring, in often cases, more stringent requirements than the DoD is at this point. And I think anybody who's in the middle of this subcontract probably knows that now. So we help a lot of subcontractors with that. And then we also might see other federal agencies are going to be including this. So if you have contracts with GSA or DHS, there's reason to believe that the CMMC or whatever CMMC might be called in the future might extend to those contracts as well. I didn't put too many of the industry-specific concerns because I would be able to take individual questions. There's going to be some very important concerns for small organizations. And again, that might be that your prime might have their own expectations and requirements. Oftentimes I see them requiring you to submit your POAMs or your system security plans, but that's not necessarily required by the DoD right now. You're not ever really sure what your next contracts are going to require. So, you may not be CMMC required to be CMMC now, and you might have facilities to keep CUI, but you might decide to be going after a contract later that does require it. A lot of small organizations use managed service providers, which means that you don't do your own IT. Not all managed service providers are in the best position to help you with that. So we need to make sure that they're good. Not all cloud service providers are the best position either. There's a requirement that they're FedRAMP compliant, and while the DIBCAC DoD has come back and tried to explain better what FedRAMP equivalent means. And I think we understand what that means. We just want to make sure that smaller companies that use cloud service providers are doing that in a good way. And then the other thing with it is the DOJ is going to be the one cracking down. So do you have smaller companies might be the targets of this as well. And then the other thing that to consider is if you're in a joint venture, you need to figure out how you're dealing with CUI under that joint venture. So, is it all under the one company, and do all the people use a different system, or is it a different? So there's lots of questions about those sort of things that need to be addressed. So. Now, there are some inherent problems with CMMC that I always mention. And one of them is that it's not an effective tool for performing vendor management. I can tell you if you pass 100%, but just being assessed doesn't give the person receiving it any of that documentation about your system, the scope, or anything else like that. So there's other mechanisms for that. So there's hopefully ways of them improving that one. It doesn't do a very good job of addressing operational technology, SCADA, and things like that, because it's 171 isn't the right certification for that. So that won't cover that. CMMC does, or 171 specifically, tends to be more document centric, not 100%, but one of the weaknesses that NIST might need to work through. And really, it's a certification, but really, it certainly isn't a maturity model, especially under the CMMC 2.0. So I always say that CMMC is not the best name because it's not really a certification or a maturity model, but especially now under 2.0.